It's late November in Guangdong Province in China. An elderly man is being rushed to the ICU at the People's Hospital of Foshan City, the nearest treatment center equipped to receive him. His name is Peng Zouyao, and he was initially admitted into his local hospital 9 days prior with a headache, cough, fatigue, and a fever of 103. 9 days and no answers. Doctors initially treated it like a severe cold or flu, but Peng was not responding to treatment, and eventually he began having severe difficulty breathing, pneumonia symptoms, and that worsened, hence now the rushing and the ICU. Doctors are mystified as tests turn up negative again and again. What could be causing this man to be so sick? I won't leave you in suspense. Luckily, all of them will manage full recoveries, but the virus that caused his family's mysterious illness spreads throughout the province by the end of the year and is quickly labeled an epidemic. Many other families won't be as lucky as Peng's. China is initially tight-lipped on details regarding the outbreak, but realize that they can't contain the virus by themselves. It knows no borders. Early the next year, just a couple months after Peng is released from the hospital, a businessman travels from Guangdong to Hong Kong and unwittingly spreads the virus again. Shortly afterwards, there are reports of cases popping up in Singapore, Taiwan, and even further abroad. Eventually, an Italian scientist is able to identify the culprit behind these unexplained cases of pneumonia as a novel coronavirus. Soon after, rapid tests are rapidly developed and deployed. Quarantine measures are put in place and masks become normalized in public as the populace band together to fight the spread. Later on, scientists will determine that the virus likely originated in horseshoe bats, with intermediary hosts such as raccoon dogs sold in the now notorious wet markets of China, though the exact sequence from bat to Peng is still debated years later. If this story sounds familiar to you, good. That's the point. Throughout this video, you're going to be hearing claims about how unprecedented the COVID-19 pandemic was, how novel the virus was genetically, how we should be sure by now of the sequence of spillovers going from bats to humans. When you hear these things, I want you to think about Peng, because his trip to the ICU wasn't in November 2019. It was 2002, 17 years earlier, and Peng Zouyao wasn't sick with COVID. He and his family had what the medical community was calling severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS for short. To be more precise, they were infected with a virus known as SARS-CoV. 17 years later, the virus SARS-CoV-2 would be the culprit behind the first true pandemic of the 21st century. If you haven't already heard the news, late April 2025 for you post-apocalyptic archivers of the future, the White House abruptly took down the official COVID.gov website and replaced it with propaganda supporting the so-called lab leak theory. What was once a web page that sought to inform people of how to keep themselves safe and healthy during a pandemic is now dedicated to spreading a conspiracy that the virus was created in and leaked from a lab in Wuhan. All of which runs counter to the consensus of both scientists worldwide and, until suspiciously recently, the American intelligence community. The new webpage contrasts the old not just in content, but in style. Say anything about the updated COVID.gov, but say it's got pizzazz. Starting at the top with the dramatic lab leak header split by a picture of Trump and COVID-19 written like it's his signature. Look up poignant in the dictionary and you'll see a screen cap of this with a reference to Schadenfreude. We then move down to the 5 COVID.gov main claims. That Fauci was the driving force in the US to cover up Chinese, not even crimes, but supposed incompetence for some reason. That COVID possesses some innately unnatural characteristic. That the pandemic was the result of a single spillover event from animals to humans, and because that's apparently different from previous epidemics, ipso facto, COVID must have been leaked. That the Wuhan Institute of Virology worked with coronaviruses under dangerous, unsafe conditions. That workers at the Wuhan lab were sick with COVID prior to the first reported cases. Therefore, they must have been the source. That we should definitely know the exact source and pathway of the virus by now. We then move down to the slick Google Maps image of Wuhan, with the distance between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the first reported cases labeled and connected by a bold line, begging the question, pulsating constantly, on and on. Even as you grow near and your ear brushes gently against it, you hear a whisper in the rhythm. It's because of the tariff wars, stupid. All of the information on this website is sourced from a congressional report, which can be found at the very bottom of the page, proudly embedded and fully readable. It's a 557-page PDF from the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, titled After Action Review of the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Lessons Learned and a Path Forward. But we'll just call it the Lab Leak Report from here on, which I don't think the authors would have an issue with. It discusses the subcommittee's findings over the previous year, everything from technical arguments for why they believe COVID was genetically engineered to criticisms of former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's nursing home policies. Yeah, it covers a lot of ground. Anyways, I've been toying around with a video idea about how physics played a role in upending a nearly century-old misconception at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. But instead, we have to do this, because how could I possibly talk about anything else COVID-related without addressing this elephant in the room? I'm still planning on doing the latter, by the way, but we'll talk about that later. For now, we're going to tackle this beast. We're going to look in depth at each of the 5+1 main claims and the evidence behind them. We're going to treat each of them seriously, even if they don't deserve it. Because one thing that is absolutely true is that, at least in the beginning, the lab leak theory was seriously considered by scientists. Also, it isn't just the right wing pushing this narrative. It seems to be going more mainstream. So I think it's worth looking at exactly why that is.
The proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 publication, which was used repeatedly by public health officials and the media to discredit the lab leak theory, was prompted by Dr. Fauci to push the preferred narrative that COVID-19 originated naturally.
Unfortunately, the website doesn't do itself any favors with Claim 0, as it's debunked on page 10 of this very same lab leak report, through the email transcript of Dr. Fauci's that it so kindly provides. Only this report treats it as if it's some sort of smoking gun. So, why? First, a bit of context. It was very early in the pandemic, just over a month after the first cases were identified in Wuhan. Some of the virologists working on the genetic sequencing of COVID and tracing back its origins had concerns of possible genetic engineering, the reasons for which we'll get into in the next claim. So, Dr. Anderson, one of the scientists of the group, reached out to the heads of the medical and scientific community for advice, which of course included Dr. Fauci as the head of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. They spoke on the phone, so we don't have record of their exact conversation, but according to the email written shortly after by Fauci,
I told Christy and Dr. Anderson that as soon as possible, he and Eddie Holmes should get a group of evolutionary biologists together to examine carefully the data to determine if his concerns about a possible lab leak are validated. He should do this very quickly, and if everyone agrees with this concern, they should report it to the appropriate authorities.
Does this mean that Fauci prompted the paper? Not really. To me, it reads more like he said, hey, go investigate this thing. So Dr. Anderson and co. went and investigated a thing, and that investigation resulted in a paper. It just turned out that, after analyzing the data with other top experts, the conclusion the scientists came to was a natural zoonotic event, meaning a spillover from animals and not a lab leak. Maybe you'd say that's splitting hairs, but certainly you'd have to admit, by the words provided by the Select Subcommittee themselves, the paper was intended to seriously investigate the possibility that the virus was leaked, not push a specific narrative. Critics may argue that these scientists were secretly being guided towards quashing alternative theories by Dr. Fauci. However, such views overlook the broader context in favor of an overly simplistic explanation. Early in a pandemic, researchers operate with very limited data under enormous pressure to understand a mysterious pathogen. Once again, I really can't stress this enough, all of this was happening in January and early February of 2020. The very first confirmed case in the US was on January 10th, only a few weeks earlier. The virus was still extremely new, and thanks in large part to the gutting of Obama's pandemic playbook, everybody was scrambling for information and resources to combat the spread. Hell, you probably remember those early days. Up to late March and into early April of 2020, even if you were sick in a ventilator, you likely couldn't be tested to show that it was actually COVID that was killing you. In fact, according to Mike Pence, by March 11th, fewer than 10,000 people had been tested in the US total, compared to 20,000 per day in South Korea. Things change rapidly. You remember how quickly it happened. First, it was just weird videos on Reddit of apartments being welded shut in China, and then a couple cases popping up at home, and some rumblings about stocking up, an SNL skit about it, and then boom. Lockdowns, infected crews, Tiger King, telling your parents to stay the fuck home, toilet paper shortages, everyone wearing gloves, imagine, Zoom calls, everyone wearing masks, some people getting mad about the mask, and then a coup almost happened. The investigation of COVID was just as frantic. And as new data came in and more experts were roped in to help with the problem, it's not surprising at all that the conclusions would have shifted between the call and the paper. None of that means the scientists were compromised in some way. The fact is, we didn't even know what we didn't know. And these scientists, people, were working with what they had.
The virus possesses a biological characteristic that is not found in nature.
Now, this is a broad claim. What biological characteristic is it talking about? What do they even mean by biological characteristic? It's hard to refute simply because of how vaporous it is. Even my high school students know to give more of an explanation than this. But I said we're going to take each claim seriously, even if they don't deserve it, so I'll refer back to the document this entire website is based on. It lists 3 different pieces of genetic red flags: the ACE2 receptor binding domain, the furin cleavage site, and the novel backbone. So what the hell do each of these words mean strung together like that? Well, let's turn it into a metaphor. The ACE2 receptor is a protein molecule that sits on the surface of human and other animal cells and acts as a sort of locked door. Normally, this door helps regulate who can come in and out. It keeps everything balanced inside the house and prevents problems like inflammation. Structural expansion. But viruses, like COVID, are like burglars who can craft their own key to unlock the door. That's the spike protein, the pointy bits that stick out of the sphere. The virus slips inside, takes over the house, and starts using the house's resources to make copies of itself, causing trouble throughout the neighborhood. Now, the furin cleavage site is like a specialized tool that makes it even easier for the burglar to break in. Furin, a protein in your body, acts like a locksmith that pre-cuts the key, making it fit the ACE2 door even better. This process helps the virus enter cells more efficiently and spread faster. Now, the fact that this virus has that special key that fits perfectly into human cells and allows it to spread like wildfire across the globe does seem a little sus on first blush. I'll give you that, Mr. Winstrup. But how sus is it really? Well, this is illustrated a bit in Dr. Anderson's House Committee interview.
So sticking with it, was it the furin cleavage site and the RBD that looked inconsistent from evolutionary theory?
Yeah, so it's important. I don't say it's inconsistent with evolutionary theory.
Expectations from evolutionary theory, excuse me.
Expectations from evolutionary theory, which is different. The reason why, just to be clear, this particular receptor binding domain at the time, we had not seen a version of that, but early analysis on that, our own as well as those of Ralph Barrick and others, suggested that it was a good binder to human ACE2. So I was perplexed by that. We had not seen that site before, but it's important, again, to understand that that's the extent of the early considerations because, of course, furin cleavage sites are broadly, seen in coronaviruses, including many beta coronaviruses, which I didn't know at the time.
So clearly, Dr. Anderson was trying to convey in the interview that while, yes, they were initially suspicious that the sites were genetically engineered, he and other authors eventually learned that these features, the furin cleavage sites specifically, are actually quite common in coronaviruses, including ones related closely to COVID-19. And before anyone says it, yes, I do know that it hasn't been found in the specific subgenus of sarbecovirus, the group in red below. That doesn't change the fact that it's a common feature among its close relatives. In fact, the furin cleavage site has evolved independently at least 6 different times within the beta coronavirus genus. This independent emergence in multiple viruses clearly demonstrates that such features can and do arise through natural evolutionary processes. So it's not hard to see how it could have happened again, more a question of when and not if. Regarding the so-called novel backbone, it's important to understand that RNA viruses like SARS-CoV-2 are masters of recombination. When 2 related coronaviruses crash the same cell party, as in when a person contracts 2 strains of COVID, they sometimes swap genetic ingredients, like kids trading Pokemon cards. They might have started out with a pristine Gen 1 deck, but somehow ended up with a deck full of boosted rare hollows, covered in goo. This natural process produces a mosaic-like backbone that may be novel, but it's really just evolution doing its thing. Kid's gonna kid.
Data shows that all COVID-19 cases stem from a single introduction into humans. This runs contrary to previous pandemics where there were multiple spillover events.
This one was a bit of a doozy to track down, and boy did I get in the weeds with it. The claim on COVID.gov is of course referencing the same lab leak report, which, get this, is itself using a New York Times article as its source. Not damning by itself, but really? I'd expect an official government inquiry to look at the original source. So that's what I did. That Times article is referencing another paper titled Evolutionary Trajectory of Diverse SARS-CoV-2 Variants at the Beginning of the COVID-19 Outbreak. That was a mouthful to say. The exact quote where this claim originates is,
"Therefore, all known SARS-CoV-2 viruses, including A0, A, B0, and B, seems to be from a common progenitor virus, which might have jumped into humans via a single spillover event, rather than 2 or multiple zoonotic events. Their co-circulation at the early phase of the epidemic might have resulted from rapid evolution of SARS-CoV-2 in human populations worldwide."
Notice the language, seems to be, and might have jumped. This cautious phrasing is how scientists communicate uncertainty. Just because the available data suggests one possibility does not mean the case is closed. Think of it this way. Imagine a detective who finds a single piece of circumstantial evidence at the site of a bank robbery and immediately concludes that there was only one thief. However, experienced investigators know that overlapping clues, like stray hairs, multiple shoe prints, and inconsistent entry points, might just as easily point to several break-ins. I'm not ruling it out entirely, but a stronger claim requires stronger evidence, and as the kids say, this ain't it, Chief. Do the kids still say that? I should say that the New York Times article wasn't just written by some internet armchair scientist, not like, some YouTube videos are. It was written by one Dr. Alina Chan, who in her own words is a scientific advisor and viral vector engineer at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Some serious credentials. Despite that, already her claims don't seem to hold much water, and unfortunately it gets worse. Another claim she makes is that early COVID case data from China also implies a single event, and further that the first infection was likely not at the Huanan market via natural spillover from bats, or some other intermediary.
The symptom onset date of the first patient identified was December 1st, 2019. None of his family members developed fever or any respiratory symptoms. No epidemiological link was found between the first patient and later cases.
Meaning they couldn't place him at the market or find a social connection to any of the other patients. First, this is absolutely not proof of a single spillover. It just isn't. But also, a lot of emphasis is placed on the fact that he was the first patient, because then, if he wasn't linked to the market, then the market couldn't have been the origin. And if the market isn't the origin, then it might have been the Wuhan lab. Except the researchers not being able to find a link doesn't mean the link doesn't exist. And just because he was the first patient identified with the disease doesn't mean he was the first to catch it. It could have been that he had a shorter incubation time within his body, and thus expressed symptoms earlier. Like at the crime scene, the very first witness interviewed may just be the one the police found first. It doesn't mean they have the earliest details, or that their account tells the whole story. Similarly, this isolated data point doesn't rule out the possibility that multiple introductions occurred, or that subsequent transmissions have obscured the original chain of events. The point is, there are many possible explanations for the data and no real evidence showing that the pandemic had a different geographic origin than the Huanan market. In fact, in another paper titled The Origin of COVID, a critical review, we get a very clear picture, literally, of the distribution of the earliest COVID cases, and it's pretty clearly centered nearest to the Huanan market, not the Wuhan lab. Others, such as Picard et al.'s paper from 2022, cited in Dr. Chan's counter-evidence, have shown that
early SARS-CoV-2 genomic diversity and epidemiology are best explained by at least two separate zoonotic transmissions, in which lineage A and B progenitor viruses were both circulating in non-human mammals before their introduction into humans.
It would be really nice if I could show you a single conclusive piece of evidence that shows the virus's origins. That's like the holy grail for everyone involved on both sides of this theory. The thing is, we just don't know for certain whether COVID was the result of a single spillover or multiple events. In that way, the content of the claim isn't exactly incorrect, but it is absolutely wrong in the confidence behind it. Just like it's incorrect to say that we know SARS or MERS were the result of multiple spillover events. Unfortunately for everyone, the forensic data is just not that cut and dry. It's inherently messy work. Also, it's really easy to miss the forest for the trees when looking at this stuff for so long. If we take a step back and actually consider what this claim is implying and the chain of reasoning required, things start to fall apart. Let's play devil's advocate for a second and grant them that the virus was from a single spillover. So what? The genetic data still suggests some sort of likely intermediary species transmission, still centered around the Huanan market, and that still doesn't contradict a natural origin. There's no written law that says viruses must spill over more than once. Moral of the story, it's not a good idea to throw around accusations when the evidence is lacking. Like my old coach used to say, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me.
Wuhan is home to China's foremost SARS research lab, which has a history of conducting gain-of-function research, gene-altering and organism supercharging at inadequate biosafety levels.
This claim is like a gradient of truth. It starts out strong. The Wuhan Institute of Virology is world-renowned in SARS and other coronavirus research. That much we can agree on. But as the sentence continues, it begins to stretch and eventually completely misrepresent the facts. So we're going to need to break this one down into bits and analyze it piece by piece. As an aside, much of the evidence from this claim comes from a 2023 report put out by the Department of National Intelligence, or ODNI for short. What's funny to me is that while it's quick to quote such lines as,
some WIV researchers probably did not use adequate biosafety precautions at least some of the time prior to the pandemic in handling SARS-like coronaviruses.
it is shockingly quiet on the main bullet points under the IC Assessments on COVID-19 Origins header.
The National Intelligence Council and 4 other intelligence agencies assessed that the initial human infection with SARS-CoV-2 most likely was caused by natural exposure to an infected animal. Almost all intelligence agencies assessed that SARS-CoV-2 was not genetically engineered. Most agencies assessed that SARS-CoV-2 was not laboratory adapted.
Not genetically engineered. Funny how the lab leak report left that part out. Admittedly, the intelligence report does mention that the Department of Energy and the FBI both believed, as of March 2023, that the virus was a lab leak, and the report is eager to mention this fact as well. Interestingly, for years the CIA, the intelligence agency that actually looks for these threats abroad, unlike the domestically focused FBI, had maintained that they remained unable to determine the precise origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet only 2 days after Trump's nominee for CIA director, John Ratcliffe, was confirmed, the agency shifted that years-long stance to say that they assess with low confidence that a research-related origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is more likely. Interesting timing is all I'm saying. Anyways, I lost the plot a little bit. Let's talk about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or we'll just call it the Wuhan Lab. Much hay has been made about the seemingly strange coincidence that the world-leading laboratory researching and experimenting on coronaviruses derived from bats was right next door to where the pandemic started, 7 miles away, in fact. On first glance, it looks pretty damning. Like, what are the odds? Well, pretty good actually, because it is absolutely not a coincidence that the lab exists there, as it sits right smack in the middle of many Chinese horseshoe bat territories, which were the exact type of bats that the Institute was studying, as well as the ones who likely harbored the COVID progenitor virus. See, it turns out that if you want to study bat coronaviruses, there are few places on Earth better than East and Central China, because that's where the bats are. In addition, many large cities throughout China contain virology institutes that also study coronaviruses, not just the Wuhan lab. A count done by Medium put the number of labs equipped to work with such viruses at over 100 in China, and it's likely far higher than that. It was only counting BSL-3 labs and higher, which we'll talk about in a moment. These are all the red dots on the map. Only 18 are shown here, a small fraction because otherwise it would just be a sea of red. Also, I'd like to note that I didn't select for location here. The labs seem to be more focused in the east, southeast especially. Likewise, due to the sheer number of people in the cities, pandemics are more likely to be first discovered there, not in rural areas. So let me cut to the chase. Discovering the virus in a Chinese city with a national virology lab is like discovering that waves happen at the beach. No shit. But what about the part where they claim the lab was doing so-called gain-of-function research? Now, you might remember this term if you were keeping up with the news back during the height of the pandemic, because it certainly made the rounds. So what does gain-of-function mean? Well, the problem is that it's not just one thing. Worse, different groups have different definitions of the term, i.e. geneticists versus microbiologists, the US government versus basically everyone else. In fact, this is what likely caused the initial confusion and suspicion. But really, gain of function is exactly what it sounds like, an organism gaining something new. Scientists tend to be very literal in their meanings. In fact, here's Professor Vincent Ricaniello from Columbia College of Medicine explaining it in very clear terms.
Gain-of-function research gives an organism a new property or enhances an existing one. The organism can be a virus, bacterium, fungus, rodent, bird, fish, or anything that can be experimentally manipulated. Many have the impression that gain-of-function research involves making an organism more deadly. For example, increasing the capacity of a virus to cause disease. That impression is incorrect. Certainly, gain-of-function research might lead to a more dangerous organism, but most of the time that is not the goal.
The term is agnostic. It can refer to making an organism more deadly, but it can also refer to giving it literally any other sort of mutation, good or bad.
So the real question is, was the Wuhan Institute of Virology actually performing this dangerous kind of gain-of-function research?
Well, yes, they were. Now hear me out. Basically, any virology lab that has the proper containment is going to perform experiments like this. That's kind of what they're built for: identification, sequencing, experimentation, and specimen infection. Each step helps scientists better understand and combat viruses. As long as the lab is properly equipped, that is normal operations.
It kind of seems like you're avoiding the issue. The real question is, did the lab operate on any coronaviruses that could have evolved into the first strains of COVID?
The short answer is no, they didn't. A slightly longer answer is, while they did, in a few cases, perform the more dangerous kind of gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses, it's not nearly as alarming as it sounds. Those strains weren't nearly close enough genetically to have been the COVID progenitor. Even the lab leak report admits this. So the unspoken portion of this claim, that the Wuhan lab performed dangerous gain-of-function research that engineered or inadvertently created COVID, is simply factually untrue based on the evidence we have. Gain-of-function research is essentially a controlled stress test, like putting a bridge under load to see how it holds up. Scientists don't actually want the bridge to collapse. You know how hard it is to build a fucking bridge? While the work may sound alarming, its aim is to understand viral behavior rather than create a new bioweapon. The fact remains, the strains studied by WIV were too genetically distant to be the culprit behind COVID-19. And then there's the part of the claim about the inadequate biosafety levels. Firstly, I want you to dismiss the image in your head that this claim likely conjures. Inadequate safety measures, whether intentional or not, gives one the impression that the scientists are like handling infected mice without gloves or storing viruses in the break room fridge, back alley science, that sort of thing. But if you've ever been in a serious research lab, you'll know just how incorrect that mental image is. Even in lesser funded university labs, there are strict policies guiding the usage of just about everything, and that is true in China as well. Hell, I remember when I was a researcher, I got chewed out by an inspector because my advisor had daisy-chained a couple of surge protectors together to make an improvised extension cable. To be fair to the inspector, that could have been a fire hazard, but my point is that when it comes to safety, every little detail is controlled according to strict policies. And just for reference, this is what the Wuhan Institute of Virology facility actually looks like. It's a state-of-the-art national lab. In a lab that deals with potentially dangerous pathogens like COVID, there are standardized safety protocols and physical lab requirements that depend on what is being dealt with specifically. They are called biosafety levels, or BSLs. If you poke around online, you'll probably find claims that COVID-19 requires the use of a BSL-3 lab, while the Wuhan lab was experimenting with bat coronaviruses using the less stringent BSL-2 guidelines. On its face, this would seem like they were operating under inadequate biosafety levels, as claimed. Unfortunately, this part doesn't seem like a fun, deliberate obfuscation to uncover. Rather, it seems to be rooted in a misunderstanding of what exact work needs to be done under what specific conditions. But first, what's the difference between BSL-2 and 3? Well, it's not just one thing, but largely it's about preventing the risk of airborne transmission, specifically when well-known dangerous pathogens are being worked on, like anthrax.
A biosafety level 3 BSL-3 laboratory typically conducts research into or works on microbes that can cause serious or potentially lethal disease through inhalation.
At the time, the prevailing medical opinion was that SARS and other upper respiratory viruses couldn't become aerosolized, meaning they could only be transferred via spit or snot droplets that were too large to float in the air. That's why masks weren't a thing until suddenly they were. The prevailing opinion was proven wrong by physics in a way that's really cool and interesting, honestly, and that's what this video was supposed to be about, but I digress. For most experiments, BSL-2 was the only requirement for SARS and other similar coronaviruses pre-COVID, not only in China, but worldwide, according to internationally accepted guidelines. The only exception to that was in the creation of viral cultures, like actually making living virus, as well as animal testing. Notably, while the Wuhan lab did create such viral cultures for similar coronaviruses, according to the evidence we have, they were neither SARS nor any of the other human coronaviruses related to COVID. Now, I'd love to just leave it at that, but the full truth is a little bit more complicated. Dr. Ralph Barrick, an American epidemiologist whose lab essentially sets the American standard on biosafety, according to him, gives a much more nuanced take in his interview with the subcommittee.
Well, I think you have to put it in perspective. So biosafety regulations in the United States are very clear, but they're heavily focused on known human pathogens. So when you move into animal pathogens that are in animals, where you don't really know the threat level, to some extent that becomes a decision between the investigator and the local IBC, which may or may not talk to federal authorities about whether this is appropriate or not. So, for example, when we started working with zoonotic coronaviruses, our underlying hypothesis was that there are strains that exist in nature. They may be rare, but they could potentially infect human cells. And if that's your hypothesis, then you do it under BSL-3. The Chinese came to their biosafety regulations are different.
So, not quite as cut and dry as we'd like it, but the bottom line is WIV weren't working with viruses known to be infectious to humans under those BSL-2 conditions. They were working with ones that were known to be specific to animals like bats, civets, or mice. And the ones they actually created, according to the evidence at hand, were only an 80% match to COVID, too far away to be the progenitor. Setting that aside, were the conditions unsafe? Well, that depends on your perspective. Post-COVID, that does seem to be the case, now that we know it can become aerosolized. Back then, it was a little more muddy.
But what about the COVID-like coronavirus that the Wuhan lab sequenced? You remember RATG13 that had a 96% similarity to COVID.
Did you just have that memorized?
Shouldn't they have used BSL-3 protocols for that?
No.
Why not?
It's so close to COVID. It's dangerous.
Close is a relative term. Sure, 96% is close, evolutionarily speaking, but on human timescales, that's a long time, somewhere between 30 and 70 years to get from rat G13 to COVID.
RATG13 is not a virus. It was never isolated and grown in cell culture. It is only a sequence obtained by metagenomics. It has no physical existence. Furthermore, having been obtained by metagenomics, there is no certainty on whether it is viable, if it corresponds to a real virus, and even if it corresponds to a single virus. Nevertheless, it is simply not possible for a virus which does not physically exist for a virtual sequence in computer to escape from a laboratory and trigger an epidemic.
Rat G13 was not a reason to have BSL-3. Aren't acronyms fun?
Well, what about the 2018 messages from the U.S. State Department in Wuhan warning about a lack of scientists being trained for BSL-4 researchers being denied BSL-4 protocols for coronavirus research? What?
Here, this is the actual cable from the 2018 State Department visit to the Wuhan Institute's fancy new lab, TM, the same year construction finished. And with this, we've come full circle on Claim 3. This is the origin of the inadequate biosafety levels claim.
So what does it say?
Well, the cable's complaint was more about the lab's early staffing and training challenges than indicating a systemic biosafety failure. Specifically, they were complaining about a lack of personnel trained for BSL-4 containment, and a lack of transparency on which teams got to use the fancy new lab, TM. And the reasons for both are completely irrelevant, because neither a COVID-like virus like rat G13 or even fucking COVID itself would have ever required a BSL-4 facility.
And what about the lead coronavirus researcher, Dr. Zhengli Shi, stating that she'd like to use the fancy new lab, TM, for SARS research, but being denied without a clear reason?
Okay, this part is a bit of speculation, but my theory goes a little something like this. Firstly, as we already established, BSL-4 is not at all required for any SARS research, not today or back then. That's just a fact. Except SARS was added to the list of viruses that the fancy new lab TM would test once it got up and running, likely for training purposes or calibration before moving on to the more deadly stuff like Ebola, which do require BSL-4. But apparently, along the way, plans changed, and Dr. Schurt did not get to study SARS in the fancy new lab TM. So it seems to me that in commenting on the lack of transparency about the change, Dr. Schurt was just being a typical research scientist, disappointed that she didn't get to use the new toy in the lab, or in this case, the lab itself. I don't know the woman personally, but that's just how it reads to a former researcher. Of all the claims on COVID.gov, though, this one is the most compelling. In hindsight, it probably would have been better for WIV to work under stricter confinement. Yet that still doesn't prove that a leak happened. All it does show is that if the Wuhan lab had the COVID progenitor, and if they hid that fact from the world, then there would have been a slightly higher chance of it leaking than if they used BSL-3. Here's Dr. Barrick again with his own thoughts on the likely origin.
The first thing that has to happen is that human populations have to come into close contact with animals that encode these viruses. Now, the vast majority of contacts where zoonotic viruses actually are introduced into a human being, most of those don't progress. The recent data with coronaviruses, for example, that was published in Southeast Asia, argues that there's somewhere between 50 to 60,000 exposures where people working with bats come into contact with bat coronaviruses and actually get infected, probably had very mild disease and recovered. 50,000. So 2002 SARS emerged, 2019 SARS-2 emerged. That's 17 years times 50,000 exposures a year, so about 1 million exposures between human disease outbreaks. This is occurring all the time. And so when you get to origins, for example, and you ask the question, what's more likely? Is it a lab leak or is it natural processes? You're looking at 1 in 1 million. No chance it's even close.
Okay, I spent way too long on Claim 3, so luckily for me, this one is pretty straightforward.
Wuhan Institute of Virology, WIV, researchers were sick with COVID-like symptoms in the fall of 2019, months before COVID-19 was discovered at the wet market.
Again, the claim is using heavy implication here while stopping short of outright making an accusation. COVID-like symptoms sounds pretty damning until you look at it for more than a few seconds. There are, of course, differences in people with comorbidities, the elderly, the smokers, the immunocompromised, and of course, that isn't to say the virus wasn't deadly to everyone else, just that the typical symptoms were pretty generic. Really, the only one that is somewhat unique to COVID is the change or loss in taste and smell. But the claim here is based on even weaker foundations than that. See, it comes from a State Department fact sheet released in January 2021. There is no source provided in the document, no report cited, no names, or no other facts at all behind this than the following sentence.
The US government has reason to believe that several researchers inside the WIV became sick in autumn 2019 before the first identified case of the outbreak, with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses.
Essentially, this is a case of vague secondhand intelligence rather than hard scientific data. The 2023 ODNI report that we discussed earlier is even more damning on the topic.
While several WIV researchers fell mildly ill in fall 2019, they experienced a range of symptoms consistent with colds or allergies with accompanying symptoms typically not associated with COVID-19.
In other words, the researchers had cold or flu-like symptoms in the middle of flu season. In other words, completely mundane and unremarkable. Zero mention of symptoms specific to COVID. While the report doesn't outright refute the possibility, they don't provide any evidence for the affirmative either. Like, at all. And that's it. I've turned up no other sources on this claim in my searching. Every news site is quoting these second and third-hand intelligence reports. So without definitive primary evidence like laboratory confirmations or a detailed symptom profile unique to COVID-19, it's just hearsay. So I'm going to call this one here. Claim debunked. Next. At this point in the original script, I spent a few pages going over each of the smaller claims below. But after spending all that time digging into congressional hearings of Dr. Daszak and EcoHealth, Fauci's own hearing, and searching for NIH grant requirements, I came to the realization that all of this is just a distraction to the question at hand. Whether or not any of these claims hold any water, whether Dr. Morin's intentionally obstructed FOIA request, which it really looks like he did, or whether EcoHealth violated gain-of-function grant conditions, none of it is evidence supporting the lab leak theory. It's all just tangentially related tidbits and things that only really bear significance if and only if their lab leak report is correct. However, since I plan on doing another video on COVID and aerosolization, I'll at least look at the claims against the efficacy of masks for now. Also, I'm going to put up a supplementary video on my Patreon for all the things I didn't get to talk about in this one. I used over 50 different sources for this, most of which were scientific papers or congressional hearings. So there's just so much information that didn't really fit into here. If you're interested in that sort of thing, consider becoming a member on my Patreon. For now, here's a study from 2021 that observed over 300,000 people in Bangladesh, looking at masking before and after awareness campaigns and reporting an almost 12% decrease in apparent COVID infections from increasing mask usage by just 28%. While 12% might not sound like much, the maximum possible effectiveness they could have had if masks stopped 100% of viral particles and everyone wore them correctly would be only 28%. So in that context, 12 ain't too bad. You might be wondering why cherry pick a random study from rural Bangladesh, of all places. Well, think about what it takes to perform a study like this. Firstly, the scale is massive, 600 villages, 342,000 people, and it had to be done at the beginning of the pandemic in an area where mask use wasn't already ubiquitous, but also after masking was recommended by the WHO, a very narrow time frame. Not exactly a feat you could perform in New York, especially if you wanted to keep control and test groups separate. But wait, there's more. Here's a study where scientists infected hamsters with COVID and then tested how likely they were to infect a second healthy hamster when separated by a mask or not. 67% transmission rate without, 17% when the infected hamster was separated by a mask. Pretty damn clear if you ask me. Or here's a few great visualizations showing how masks prevent droplets from spewing into the air and an airflow reduction overall. It takes a certain threshold of viral particles to be inhaled for COVID or any other virus to be spread. It's called the viral load. Inhaling any less than that threshold, and the immune system will likely be able to handle it before any disease occurs. Of course, the threshold will be different from person to person, and masking isn't always perfect, like with the chin strappers or interference from facial hair. But all said, masks reduce the number of viral particles escaping into free air as saliva droplets, meaning fewer make it to the healthy person, barely any at all if they're both wearing one. I mean, it's not exactly rocket science. Masking equals fewer droplets in the air. Fewer droplets equals less likely to catch COVID. Honestly, I can't believe we're still deliberating this in 2025.
By nearly all measures of science, if there was evidence of a natural origin, it would have already surfaced, but it hasn't.
I'm not even going to try and mask my disdain for this one, as it's an appeal to science while being the least scientific claim of the bunch. If number 2 was vaporous, then this is absolutely non-corporeal. I think there's a reason why they left it for last. It sounds punchy, by all measures of science. But in reality, uncovering the natural origin of a virus is like trying to reassemble a shredded manuscript from hundreds of tiny pieces scattered across different locations. It's inherently messy. The idea that scientists would be guaranteed to find a patient 0, or the bats that carried the progenitor, or the likely multiple intermediary species that carried the next in the line of mutations, is just at odds with how science works. We'll call it Hillary's Law. No result is ever guaranteed. Ever. A little 2016 election joke for you. Never let it be said that I'm not topical on this channel. In the scientific process, conclusions are drawn from a constellation of clues, each imperfect on its own, but together they build a consistent narrative. The absence of a single definitive piece of evidence does not invalidate a natural origin. It simply reflects the challenges of tracking complex zoonotic transmissions. But the thing is, scientists do have a trail. Dr. Schur had warned the world of the next coronavirus pandemic in early 2019, after finding somewhat similar viral DNA sequences in bats. Those tests indicated that a human spillover was close. But given the differences in DNA sequences, even the closest bat sequence was too far away genetically to have been the first strains of COVID. That's what led virologists to the idea that the first cases were caught from an intermediary animal. While the site is correct in that we haven't found one of those intermediary viruses in other species, there is evidence that has connected the outbreak to raccoon dogs being sold illegally in the Huanan market, as their DNA was found in the same swabs as the first COVID samples obtained from the site. Of course, this evidence isn't definitive. We haven't found a live animal carrying the virus. Truthfully, it's possible that we'll never have conclusive proof of the virus's origins. The story of Peng Zuyao's rapid descent into a mysterious respiratory illness in 2002 was strikingly similar to the ones that basically everyone in the world lived through in 2020, either directly or through a loved one. I myself lost my grandma as she caught the virus around Christmas of 2020 and passed shortly after. She had fallen prey to much of the online rhetoric that minimized everything, including the deadliness of the virus, and so she wasn't taking the recommended precautions. Until it was too late.
Merry Christmas, Shirley.
You got a bag now, Merry Christmas.
It's bordering on understatement to say that the COVID pandemic was a traumatizing time for everyone involved, the consequences of which reverberate throughout society and bear fruit that might only come to light years later. There's a very human desire to take such events and apply intention to them, even when no such intention exists. I think I said almost the exact same thing in my Satanic Panic video, but the same applies here and for virtually all conspiracies. Each of COVID.gov's claims are built on a curious, precarious foundation, one made almost entirely of what's missing rather than what's known. The lab leak report itself relies heavily on noting the absence of certain expected findings rather than presenting robust affirmative evidence of an actual lab leak. In other words, its evidence is largely found in the negative space, the gaps, and the silences. This negative space is telling, but not in the way that COVID.gov or the lab leak report would claim. Rather than proving that a lab leak must be the answer, it only underscores the inherent challenges of reconstructing genetic timelines. Science rarely delivers a neatly packaged, definitive answer, especially when dealing with a virus like COVID, rapidly spreading under conditions of chaos and limited early data. The absence of an unequivocal proof should be seen less as an invitation for baseless speculation than as a clear demonstration that nature's whims are inherently complex and often escape the full capture of our current capabilities. By leaning on what isn't there, a solid chain from bats to humans, COVID.gov and the lab leak report each inadvertently reveals its own limitations. Instead of showing hands-on evidence that the lab is to blame, it merely suggests that because we haven't found a perfect natural precursor, there must be something foul afoot. It conflates absence of evidence with evidence of absence. And while that can be a dangerous misstep for scientists, it is far, far worse when amplified by talking heads and journalists and YouTubers and anyone else with a platform. It spreads misinformation and doubt at unprecedented rates, and in a pandemic, misinformation costs lives. We may never know the true origins of COVID, but that lingering question isn't an excuse to hurl accusations. In today's climate, where the line between verified fact and opinion is alarmingly blurred, misinformation not only corrupts public discourse, but also cripples our ability to respond to crises. Every unfounded claim chips away at the public's trust in science, fueling policies driven more by sensationalism than by solid evidence. We have to stay vigilant in verifying sources and doing the due diligence that others might take for granted, because the only way to combat misinformation is with truth.
To push the preferred narrative that COVID-19
Originated?
Why? Why can't I read right now? Okay. This one's gonna be perfect. To push the preferred narrative that COVID-19 originated. To push the preferred narrative that COVID-19 originated naturally.
Got it right.
I know. It's so funny.